Assalamu alaikum. Hello and a warm welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In today's program, we're going to be looking at migration and UK multiculturalism. I have a very special guest with us, I should start with Professor Lord Kamlesh Patel of Bradford, OBE, a great personality in Bradford and across the UK. A warm welcome, Kamlesh.
Lovely to be here today. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for coming. And one of the reasons I wanted to get you here, Kamlesh, was you've been quite an inspirational figure for a lot of people in Yorkshire and across the country. Just to mention some of your achievements, clearly you've made great contributions in the world of academia and your professorship. You were obviously awarded the OBE, and we'll go through the different stages. And I understand you're either a president or a patron of over 35 charities. And enviously, I would say you're also on the board of the ECB, the cricket board.
Yes.
So these are some of the great achievements you've made. But one of the things that gets me is currently a lot of people, when they look at people with a different skin, a different background, they get concerned. Recently, The Independent did a survey where they found immigration to be the greatest concern to every one of them, and also general problems of racial tension and extremism. And yet, we see great people like you making such a valuable contribution. Let's just start with why you are here and how some of us got here in relation to Britain. So tell me a little bit of where you were born and how you relate to the British and the British Empire.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's almost cycles in the world, 20-year cycles, maybe more, around specific things, and migration is one of them. Things happen over a period of time, and when you look back, you think that happened then. And I suppose some of the fear, the anxieties, the xenophobia that exist today probably were around when I was a child. So, why did I come here? Well, I was born under British rule, but in Kenya. So my mother was and my father are both from Indian descent, but my mother was born in South Africa. And South Africa has its own particular history of apartheid and other things, so that's very interesting. She was born in South Africa. My dad was born in India, and they moved to Kenya as many Indians migrated to there for building the railways and other things. My dad happened to be a master chef, so he moved there alongside doing his maths teaching. He was a maths teacher as well. I was born under British rule, like I said, 1960, and then came the Kenyatta government. And I suppose that was the time of the first big exodus for certainly East African Asians to come to Britain. If you were not a Kenyan, then you were classed as a foreigner, and you couldn't get work permit, and there was a huge exodus of East African Indians who came to Britain because of the links to the Commonwealth. We were part of the Great British Empire. And I suppose people forget, how many Indians, when India was together with Pakistan, and, the contribution to the world wars that we made, the sacrifices that we made, and that we were part of the Great British Empire. So I suppose we came back to our colonial masters and looked to come here. There were opportunities in Britain then. Britain clearly needed a workforce after the Second World War. It looked to its colonial partners, the Commonwealth. People from the Caribbean came, people from India, Pakistan, others came. So our first exodus of East African Asians came in 1961, and then about the second large exodus,
later
due
on,
to somebody called General Idi Amin.
Yes.
So I came when I was one, February 1962, I think we had, my mum tells me, she told me before she passed away that, 6 inches of snow. We came from a sunny, warm climate into the coal mills of Bradford. Most of my relatives, most of my cousins and others went to Leicester in the Midlands. Why did we come to Bradford? My father had a sister here who was married to somebody who did a wholesaling business here. So we came to Bradford. I think we we lived. It's all knocked down now. A little street called Cobden Street and Bright Street. They're two famous streets that continue to exist around the country, named after two politicians. Actually, I could count on the fingers of one hand other brown people. So
indeed, there were so few at that stage because my eldest brother came in '61, and he tells me there was just so few of them around at that stage.
There were probably a dozen families around the Bradford 7 area, and that was probably it. And I was too small, I suppose. We lived in a one-bedroom back-to-back. My two sisters, my two brothers, and my mum and dad. No outside, no inside bathroom or toilet. It was the cellar was the sort of coal cellar became your bathroom, and your toilet was outside, and that's what you lived in, and that's how you were brought up. So times were tough.
You obviously went to the primary schooling, and then the sort of, I think Bradford used to have middle schools, then upper schools, etc. When did you first become conscious of really being a British citizen and what your parents were going through or what they thought, and reflections on maybe back home in Kenya and being here? When did you start picking that up?
Well, ironically, I didn't go to school till I was about 7 because nobody had registered me, so nobody actually even knew I existed. So my mum was quite protective because she'd had quite a tough life, and my sister passed away very early on, and so she'd left me at home. So I used to just play outside, and then I suppose and I don't know if it was a conscious reality, but I didn't go to school like all the other white children that I used to play in the street with, because we were sent to immigrant centres. So we were sent to an immigrant centre to learn English, except it felt like English was my first language because, I was growing up here, I spoke Gujarati, but I couldn't read and write, because times were too tough and nobody had the time to work with me. So I went to the immigrant centre for a while, then ended up in a sort of a primary school and then a secondary school. So the Grange was a small
your early
primary.
childhood is quite fascinating, to be honest, because given what you've achieved, which we'll deal with throughout the programme, you had very, very humble beginnings, and it's just so inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, we had nothing. I suppose I never had ambitions to be anything, or I was probably just generally ambitious. So, if we played marbles on the street, I wanted to win. If we wanted to play our Indian games, we used to play pittu. It was like 7 stones and you had to hit it with a tennis ball. Yeah. I wanted to win. If we played hopscotch, I wanted to win. And that's all it was. I just wanted to win. I wasn't exceptionally bright. I was a very hard worker because my dad worked 14 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week. So I thought that's what you had to do. From a extremely early age, I was doing paper rounds. I was working in restaurants, sweeping floors. So I always worked, and that never bothered me. Holidays didn't interest me. It was work and playing cricket.
So you went through, obviously, your schooling, and you went to sixth form and left?
Yes, I went to school, and I think in my secondary school, somewhere along the line, the penny dropped that if I wanted to be really good at something, I needed also to be good at education. So purely just to be good at something, I started to teach myself quite a lot. And while I was at secondary school, won the History and Religious Education Prize. Then went to Bellevue Boys, and Bellevue Boys was very different in those days. I remember going to Bellevue Boys being terrified out of my skin. It's probably the first time I travelled away from that Bradford 7 area. Got on 2 buses and travelled to what seemed a very far away place, which was a majority white school, a small percentage of African Caribbeans, and a very small percentage of Asian lads. We were regularly bullied. I've been through the history of skinheads chasing you and packy bashing, which is what we learnt and learnt to develop through. I think most of my friends, Indians and Pakistani young people who I knew because we all played cricket together, were probably very timid because our parents were timid, and they always said, just keep away from trouble. And that's what we did. We kept away from trouble. We got picked on. We got bullied. Somewhere along my schooling, I decided I wasn't going to be timid and bullied, and I wanted to have it my way. In that school, it was very difficult. We were physically smaller than most other kids. I think because we were probably not. Actually, we probably we didn't have a good diet. We were small. The only reason I did reasonably well and didn't get bullied and actually had my way is because I was really good at cricket and I became the captain of the cricket team. So when you're captain of something, people gravitate and become friends.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was a great start. And, you know, some of the teachers were fantastic. But you really learnt in life that you were different. You were not going to succeed or do as well as your white counterparts. That was almost drilled in subconsciously, you know, and you just had to make the best you could of it.
So from school, rather than going to university, you decided to get work experience?
We couldn't afford for me to go to university, so I did reasonably well at school because I wasn't a genius by any stretch of the imagination, so I got a handful of GCSEs. I ended up doing my A-levels. Ironically, my worst subject in primary school and secondary school was English, and I ended up doing A-level English and getting the English prize because I love stories, so I did English literature and Shakespeare, which was very unusual, again, for an Asian lad. It wasn't maths or chemistry or science.
Sciences,
It was history and English and general knowledge. So very much an arts background and cricket. And I probably mixed with people outside of my community because of cricket, because my sports teacher, you know, bless his heart, Richard Noble, and I'm in touch with him to this day. He was the opening bowler for a team called Manningham Mills, which in those days was one of the best Bradford League teams. Phil Sharp was the captain, and we had a game between pupils and teachers. And after that, he said to me, "You need to come to Manningham Mills with me," and took me to play Manningham Mills. I was the only Asian kid in that whole setup. I think about three Asian lads played in the Bradford League, and that was it. And yet, you know, there were hundreds of Asian lads. So I got introduced into Yorkshire cricket and coaching environments in a very hostile environment. But I love cricket.
But did you face, obviously you faced some racism, etc. Did you feel any resentment? How did you actually handle it? Or did you just turn it
I think because the way our parents brought us up to put up with it,
Yeah.
which is a very different culture now, it was almost a little bit like apartheid. You accepted it. That was fine. So you've seen me a number of times and I'm always wearing a suit and a tie and shirt. That's from early childhood because I realised being brown skinned going in somewhere, people looked at you differently.
Yeah.
So to make it better, I put a shirt and tie on. So from a very early age, I wore a shirt and tie, and I can't stop wearing it now. So even at weekends, I'll wear a shirt and tie sometimes.
Yeah, you have that
but
image
it's because
created,
it's that image. It got you halfway through the door. Life was still a struggle. So I wanted to go to be a PE teacher, but we couldn't afford for me to go to university. So while I was studying for my A-levels, I was a part-time waiter at what is now the Bradford Hotel, was called Norfolk Gardens, and it was owned by the Stackish chain. So when I left school, after I finished my A-levels, I became a full-time silver service waiter. And that taught me a lot. It taught me how the other world lived. You were serving a restaurant called the room at the top restaurant, and people were coming having very expensive meals, and it was very nice. And I was a silver service waiter. And then I became a barman, and I saw a lot of the world through those eyes, even though I'd learnt a lot. And I did a lot of volunteering, and I held down 2 or 3 jobs, and then moved into sort of a work career, looking for something to do in life. One day somebody came in. I used to talk a lot, as you can tell, behind the bar, and he said, "Would you like a job?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Come to my office in the morning and I'll give you a job." And I went to his office in the morning, and he asked me to sell life insurance. So I took the job as selling life insurance.
You eventually moved into the council, didn't you, in social services, and from there really the whole world started changing, and we're going to tackle that, the social services there.
Yeah, social services was completely by accident. I worked in what was Someone House as a manager. I worked for Ladbrokes as one of their youngest betting office managers. The best job I ever had ever in those days was an ambulance man. Spent 2 years in the ambulance service. I worked with the police, and then I stumbled into this job called a social worker. So my now wife was one of the first Asian social workers in Bradford, and I think Bradford was way ahead of the game. Bradford Social Services had a reputation across the country for being ahead of the game in terms of employing, for the first time ever, Asian people into the social services. They took them untrained, looked for talent and trained them up and made them professional social workers. And that's when I joined, way back in 1983. I became a social worker in Keighley.
You're obviously a very determined person and you're a very good communicator. Did you not think of going into politics or whatever? Because it was much later on, wasn't it, really, when you took a deeper interest? Well, actually,
much later on. I never enjoyed politics. I never enjoyed watching it, never enjoyed talking to people about politics, though I was asked, ironically, several times to become a councillor. I didn't actually even know what a councillor did. And I suppose I was driven by just, wanting to be successful at something. So I was, as you can tell, hunting around for the right job. In those days, you could jump from job to job. And I had a passion, I had a flair. People give me a job. I always insisted, interestingly enough, when I was going to the job for the interview, especially in social work, don't give me this job if you're giving me it because I'm Asian. I don't want it because of that. I want to be a good social worker. And I purposely worked in areas where Asian communities were not settled. So Keighley in those days had a very small Asian community. I worked with loads and loads of different white communities with mental health, elderly, learning disabilities, because I wanted to prove I was a good social worker and I was going to be a good manager.
Clearly, later on, your biggest contributions, as we'll talk about them, have been in academia and then also in the political and healthcare, social care area. But your big break came when you decided to go and study at university social care, was it? And were you at the council then?
I was at the council. And again, as I said, Bradford Social Services was very clever in its use of government funds. It sent a number of us to become qualified social workers. So I went to Huddersfield University, or then it was Huddersfield Polytechnic, to become a qualified social worker. And that opened my eyes into a different world, because that gave me, for my first time in my life, an opportunity to think, to realise what academia brought to you, discussion with people. And I again went down a different route to everybody else. I had 2 placements, one in the probation service, and I made a television documentary with West Yorkshire Probation with Jonathan Dimbleby way back about social work training and probation. And there was clearly a career I could have entered in the probation service. And where in the mid-80s, I went to do something really odd and work with drug users that nobody else had done. Drug use had just come into Britain. Something, and whether it's inherent entrepreneurism in Asians, I thought the future is in 2 things: in criminology, in crime, and it's going to be probation, or I think we're going to have a big issue with drug users, and that's going to be a big future. And I did a piece of research while I was a student into looking at why Asian people didn't present to drug services, and it was published in the British Journal of Social Work, and that kicked off my interest in working with drug users in the country.
How did you find the response of the Asian community in relation to this subject? Because it's something that generally frowned upon, do you think?
I was the first person ever to do research, probably in the world, on Asian drug users and Asian heroin users particularly. I travelled to Pakistan. I went through from Islamabad right through to Mirpur and to the Khyber Pass to look at trafficking issues. I wrote lots and lots of articles and ended up writing a couple of books on drug use among South Asian communities, trying to prove to government that they were wrong in their analysis, and try to prove that the British Crime Survey was wrong in its analysis, that Asian people and black people are the least likeliest group of people to use drugs. I said you're wrong. What we're doing wrong is several people have buried their heads in the sands. The services don't attract people into the services because it's devised primarily to work with white heroin users. Our own community was the most vehement to say, stop doing this. We do not use drugs and you're pathologizing us. And, I work with lots of Pakistani families and drug users, and the mosques in those days said, go away. Don't raise this as an issue. I suppose if somebody told me to go away from something, I did more into it. And it was interesting, sort of 10, 20 years later, I've worked with just about every Asian community in every inner city area, with most mosques and gurdwaras and temples all wanting my help to change the situation and change government policy, which I eventually did.
I mean, obviously, we're going to discuss the centre that you set up as well. But looking back, where do you think we are as a society? Because drug usage and misuse has been a common thing in most countries, and particularly so in Western countries. Are we getting better? Is it under better control or not? What do you think?
Oh, drug use generally is, we're still talking the second biggest business in the world next to the arms race. I think it's bigger than the oil trade.
Wow.
And it's certainly bigger than food trade. So, this is something that's not going to go away. It's something that started here in the early 80s and has grown from, heroin to crack cocaine to, modified drugs to now new psychoactive substances. And any community that is in the middle of that history developing, that's deprived in various ways, that's deprived chances, is going to be prone to, facing those issues. I don't for 1 second say the Asian community were wrong to say don't focus on this, because I think they were we were protecting our own image, and we didn't want to be pathologized any more than we were about lots of other things. Asians are taking our jobs, Asians are doing this, black Caribbeans are committing crime. So you didn't want to be pathologized, you wanted to protect your own community. But unfortunately, by doing that, we bury our heads in the sand and allow things to happen.
When you were doing your degree in social sciences, how did you feel about the university environment? Much more enjoyable than the school environment and work environment, or? Yeah,
completely different world. And I suppose the social work degree in those days was about that. It was about trying to look at the world from a different viewpoint, about looking at people being judgmental, about putting yourself in other people's shoes, and it allowed you to grow and look. And, it was a really good course. It recognised the lecturers there, recognised that one thing that they didn't do very well was teach social workers to work with diverse communities. So, there were a few of us on that course who actually almost became lecturers to say, that's wrong. Everybody has a different value base. You have to accept it, and you have to work differently.
Obviously, your degree was at which place?
Huddersfield.
Huddersfield. So you were still in West Yorkshire.
Still in West Yorkshire.
And then obviously, when you got your degree, you went off to Central Lancashire.
No, after I got my degree, I came back to Bradford to work as a social worker.
Okay.
And then I did the odd thing of going to work in the voluntary sector, and I working with drug users. So I was one of the first people who set up a mother and baby drug rehab in the country. I set up one of the first people to set up community drug services, needle exchange schemes. So it wasn't about working with Asian people or black people. It was being a manager of an organisation that worked with drug users in the UK. So I then started to question UK drugs policy and realised that we have to work with politicians, because unfortunately the United Kingdom, like most other countries, doesn't make drug policy based on evidence. It makes drug policy based on what the public think, because that's what gives you votes. So we have really good evidence to say how we should develop drug services. And that's what I made my mission in life to do, to make sure we have evidence-based drug policy. And then I stretched out to work with people with mental health problems.
So your Central Lancashire stint as a lecturer, was it initially?
Yeah, so then I developed a drug service here. I developed a mental health service for Asian women here in Keighley and in Bradford. I eventually left working in the voluntary sector to take up a role as an academic at the University of Central Lancashire. I was a senior lecturer in health and social care, so I was able to lecture in social work and I was able to lecture in the health field. I did that for a year and got quite bored because I just, I was used to doing several things and, running things and managing things. So I was going to leave, but the university said, stay, do some research, and we'll allow you to grow and develop your publishing, which I'd been doing quite a lot of. My ambition was to set up a university centre, and they said, sure, it'll take you 5 or 10 years to do that. And I wanted to set it up in 6 months. And the agreement was, if I brought in £1 million worth of funding, that I could set up an academic centre. In 6 months, I set up an academic centre called the Centre for Ethnicity and Health, which, 10 years on, grew into one of the largest research centres in the world. We had 100 staff looking at alcohol, drugs, mental health, crime, extremism, 23 professors working in the centre all around this country and all around the world.
I think this is when things really started taking off, and it's probably a good place to have a break. We're going to carry on with this interesting discussion after the break. Thank you, Lord Kamlesh Patel.
Thank you.
So welcome back. We were talking about the Centre for Ethnicity and Health that you set up. It was a groundbreaking centre, world-renowned, I think. So just take me through a little bit more of how you got the funding and set up for it.
One of the things I learnt working in the local authority and social services and in the voluntary sector was to be creative and innovative. And I came across lots and lots of researchers who did research and produced very nice glossy reports that sat on the shelf. And the one thing I realised is that didn't change people's lives. But what we did do, we intruded on people's lives. So we quite happily parachuted into a city like Bradford or anywhere else for that matter, interviewed lots of people and progressed our academic careers with articles about how life was not good and how things might change and more research should happen. And we produced wonderful publications and disappeared, but we didn't change people's lives. So one thing I did when I set up the Centre for Ethnicity and Health, we said that we will never conduct research on an individual or a community or an organisation unless it actually has some impact and changes that person's life or that organisation's services. And I think that's what made us successful. So we, and I say we because it wasn't just me, but I recruited a research assistant, one person, and we grew from that one person to 100 staff. So I gathered people with very different backgrounds, a bit like mine. They were not necessarily academics, but they were really good at speaking to the people, engaging, researching and writing. And it was my passion of developing appropriate services for drug users throughout the country, developing appropriate mental health services throughout the country, developing appropriate health and social care services throughout the country, developing services for offenders, prisoners, I suppose people who were disadvantaged in life. And we needed to change that because it was costing a lot of money, and society has a responsibility to develop and people who are part of that society. So the research we did actually had an impact. We give solutions, not just pose problems. And I think because we did that, we grew very rapidly from working with local authorities around the country to different health trusts around the country to developing major projects for the Home Office, for the Ministry of Justice and for the Department of Health. And people then came to us because it was an organisation that spoke to grassroots people, that used that intelligence to help come up with practical solutions to change. And that's what I've been like. I get bored very quickly. Things need to change and things need to happen. We have an unfortunate culture in public services that carries on doing the same old thing because that's what your job's about. No, we need to change, and that's why the NHS and health and social care probably got into the mess we have, because we haven't been creative or innovative, and we've never listened to people who actually use our services and change because it doesn't suit managers.
Clearly, your work was being recognised nationally and internationally as well. And in 1998 when you got the OBE? Is that right? Must have been.
Yes, 1998. I thought I'd got a letter from the taxman actually, and it was great to to be recognised. And to this day, I have no idea who put me forward and how I got it. I knew I was doing two very big things. One in the mental health world. I was developing services for detained patients, and I was looking at race inequality in mental health services. I was working with the Home Office and others on drugs policy. So I assume it's come because of those additional things that I did in my own time and those policy changes that I wanted to make. So having an OBE was a big thing for somebody like me. I wasn't a professor then, so that gave me an opportunity to develop. I think the hardest thing I've ever done was to become a professor, because that was achieving an academic level that was recognised by your peers internationally in terms of your contribution to academia and to the academic world.
So when did you get the professorship?
I became a professor in 2001. My first chair was, so I have three particular chairs. One was around my work on drug use and drug policy. I have another professorship around mental health, policy and practice, and on the wide area of public health, but more around crime and offenders and prisons.
And then things got even bigger and better. In 2006, you got peerage and Lord Kamlesh Patel of Bradford. So it was a proud moment for the citizens of Bradford as well to have somebody associated from Bradford as well. Take me through that. Must have been a wonderful moment. And tell me a little bit about the crossbencher bit, because not everybody understands that. Yeah,
it was... while I ran the Centre for Ethnicity and Health, I was lucky enough to be involved in several government strategies. I was chairing a number of national government bodies, and I developed a huge portfolio of not just academic work but policy change and legislative change. And then I was nominated out of the blue to become a peer. Now, there's three ways that you can come into the House of Lords. Obviously, Parliament is made up of three entities. The House of Commons are 650 MPs that are elected by their local constituents to represent them on a political party. The House of Lords, which is the second chamber that's there to scrutinise government and scrutinise legislation and improve legislation, and the monarch. There's three ways to get into the House of Lords. One is a political appointment. So maybe you've been a member of either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party or the Liberal Democrats for a number of years. You maybe have been a minister, a Home Secretary, you might have been a Prime Minister. And from your political party, you are nominated to take up a seat on either the Conservative, Labour or Liberal Democrat benches. The second way is a Prime Minister, when he or she retires, can nominate a number of people who have contributed to their tenure, so maybe ambassadors or civil servants who've contributed to the development of British legislation and society. And they're nominated, but not to a political party. They sit on something called the crossbenches. That's an independent person sitting in the House of Lords. Then the third way is what they used to call people's peers, and they're crossbenchers. So we have around 180 crossbenchers in the House of Lords who are individuals who've excelled in their field of activity. So they may be brain surgeons, heart surgeons, they may be High Court judges, they may be renowned barristers. They have done something that's beyond what their job was, and they've contributed to society, and they have the skills to scrutinise legislation and change legislation and be able to debate and challenge and write and contribute. And they have to go through almost an interview process. So somebody nominates you, you have to apply, and you are scrutinised yourself very heavily, and you are interviewed, and you go through a very rigorous interview process by the Appointments Commission. I was nominated, went through that process, and was fortunate enough to be appointed in 2006 as an independent crossbench peer to the House of Lords.
And then obviously, over time, you chaired and presided over many different bodies, including the Mental Health Commission. I think you chaired that for many years.
Many years.
Then you set up the National Strategic
Work on mental health. So when the Labour Party was in government, I was a National Strategic Director at the Department of Health.
Mental health and
I set one of the biggest race equality mental health programmes probably in the world. A huge multi-agency project. So I've been used to working on very large-scale strategic programmes to make large-scale change. And I think the House of Lords allows me then to introduce that policy change into legislation, and I carry with me the experiences that of working directly with people. So I know, I hope I know, and I can contribute to changing legislation to make sure it actually works at the grassroots level.
You changed over though from the crossbencher to the Labour group.
Yes.
Tell me how that happened.
I worked for a number of years as a crossbencher. Labour were in power. I give Labour actually a very hard time as an independent peer because there was some terrible legislation around mental health that I challenged and changed. Labour, then we had the 7/7 bombings and the Prevent strategy, and I was asked after a few years being in the House of Lords by Gordon Brown and the then leader of the House of Lords, Baroness Ashton, to come and work with the then Secretary of the Communities and Local Government Department, Hazel Blears, who was a Cabinet Secretary, to help her work around engagement and extremism. I'd done a lot of research with Scotland Yard for about 2 or 3 years. Through my research, I'd worked with lots of community groups around the country. So I was very interested in working with Hazel, who had a great vision to what she wanted to do, to actually just get the community's voice into some policy and practice. But in order to do that work, it was the Labour Party insisted I joined the Labour backbenches because I would have access to a lot of confidential information. I didn't really want to join a political party because I'm not a politician. I didn't really want to get involved in politics, but I wanted to do the work, so I did become a Labour backbencher and work with Hazel and other people around that area. And then, again, completely out of the blue, in the last tenure of Brown's government, I was appointed to the front benches. So I became a politician right at the front, sharp end, representing 4 government departments in the House of Lords. Communities and Local Government, the Ministry of Justice, the Cabinet Office and the Attorney General's Office. And hence I came across people like Baroness Scotland, who was the Attorney General, like Jack Straw was the Minister of State and Minister of Justice and others. And I learnt a huge amount about how government operates and how policy and legislation is really made. I was very much at the sharp end of it. Very hard time, but a great learning environment for me. Not something I enjoyed terribly, politics, but I enjoyed learning about how you have to compromise, how you have to wait, how you have to develop politics with a small p and a big P, and develop change and initiate change. And I think that learning's been very helpful over the years.
And then in 2014, Bradford were fortunate enough to get you back as the chairman of one of the biggest acute trusts, the Bradford Teaching Hospital Acute Trust. You also chaired the Producer City Board, which is a major body looking at regeneration of Bradford. And of course, you're a director on the ECB. So you've held some fantastic posts and many others, as I said at the start. And one of the things this has clearly shown is, how this country rewards people with determination, ambition, a drive, and you've clearly shown that. But I want to use the remaining few minutes that we have to look at some of the challenges that this country faces and our communities that face as well. So, because clearly you're able to sit and talk with lots of different people from high up in authority, and you have clearly shown that you understand people at grassroots level as well. As you were growing up then, if we look back at this country, it's gone through a major transition over the years in terms of ethnicity, immigration, the way our manufacturing base became downsized, whatever. But let me touch on the first one, which was the 80s. The Scarman report, the riots with the young people, whatever. How did you relate to that when you were going through academia and all your different developments? Because clearly that was a sort of a rebellion in Brixton with young people. How did you see, and did we address the challenge in the right way, do you think?
Those were big challenges. I mean, the Scarman report and then the sort of disturbances that followed, almost in a with a cycle over 5-10 year periods, we've seen things come back. Stephen Lawrence and it influenced people like me greatly, because it was a dichotomy really, because you saw huge inequality in a society that actually you were part of. And there was huge inequality in terms of how people were policed, their job prospects, their employment prospects. And it was, that discrimination was based on something completely illogical. The colour of somebody's skin, which is completely illogical. Because, as your listeners are listening to me now, if they couldn't see me, they'd think, that's a nice Yorkshireman speaking. Well, I hope they think I'm a nice Yorkshireman. So that's it.
Well, it's a broad,
I'm a Yorkshire
wonderful
lad.
Yorkshire
broad
accent.
Yorkshire accent. I'm a Yorkshireman first and foremost. But I was born in Kenya. My mum was born in South Africa. My dad was born in India. I'm me, and you need to understand where I'm coming from. Unfortunately, skin colour, whether it's black or brown, influences how people react, and whether it's an unconscious bias, and that's not gone away. It's become more subtle. It's become, prevalent in different ways. So in the 60s and 70s, it was very clear. No Irish, no dogs, no blacks, and no Pakis was the sign we had. Go away, and you knew. Very clearly. I think as society's got more sophisticated, that happens not overtly, but it happens in people's minds, and it's still there. That inequality exists, But I still think Britain is one of the best places in the world to be. I think we are one of the most tolerant societies and cultures. The fact that I was an immigrant child here that wasn't very bright, but was determined to work hard and sacrifice lots of things. And I've got where I am today, I'm there making legislation and laws, never mind sort of trying to scrape for a job. So if you're prepared to put in, you will get back. You only have to look at the Asian diaspora in this country. It's one of the most successful diasporas anywhere in the world. We came as, in the 60s and 70s in an alien world with a question mark hanging over our identities as bus conductors, as cleaners, as sweepers, as, working in as porters, restaurant workers, corner shop owners, to one of the most successful diasporas in the world. You only have to look down the rich list to see how many Asian people are there at the top of their game in business, but not only in business, in entertainment, in sport, in legislature. We're the second largest, Asian legislature in the world outside of India. Now that says something about a country that, as a community we've contributed and we've reached out and we've got things. Like all communities, I think, for me, it's about being transparent and honest. And this is where we struggle. And I think I've always been very forthright in saying, take your head out of the sand. There's an elephant in the room. So it's nice to be nice and talk about nice things. We didn't tackle drug use that happened in our communities. Because we didn't tackle drug use that happened, we allowed a criminal market to grow. That didn't do our communities any good. We didn't address issues of, discrimination, mental health and stigma. We've suffered for that. We have to tackle things when they're wrong within ourselves. Understandably, you're always fighting against people who then exploit that and say, well, it's because you were migrants, you were immigrants, you were black, you were Asian, and then that's moved from being black and Asian to Muslims.
Tell me, you're a very knowledgeable person who's seen society from lots of different angles. As a country, clearly it's had a fantastic history, and out of all the European countries and probably countries across the globe, and clearly during empire, it built, it grew. This city we're in Bradford, it was one of the centres of the world in terms of its wealth or whatever, but over time things declined. Have we done enough, though, to address the social divisions, though, in terms of the different class? We still have these divisions of the working classes, middle classes. Have we done enough, do you think, in a challenging world, in a changing world?
No, the answer's always going to be a simplistic answer would be no. Because, and my simplistic view of the world is, look, when people came here into the 60s, the people in power in government, didn't have good economic policies. So people started to become unemployed, economy hit. So it was nice to introduce this sense of, well, it's not our fault. It's these migrants who won't go away, but we've introduced immigration laws to send them back, but they're not going. So that encourages immediately this idea, like it does now, these foreigners are taking our jobs. We do not want them to come and live in our areas. So we all lived in areas that were probably ghettoised. We lived together for safety reasons because you have a backlash of people who live here who felt we were the problem. Not politics was the problem, but we were the problem. We never addressed that properly, and that's erupted and evidenced itself in things like the Brixton riots, the Tottenham riots, and and other disturbances across the country. That always happens in society. You can't just ignore a group of people, use them and abuse them when you want them, and then ignore them and not give opportunities for people to do well. That's not purposely done. That's done, it's human nature that develops and does these things. And it's almost too late.
Tell me also, as somebody who's able to see different cultures and different sectors of society develop, how do you think the Afro-Caribbean society has fared here compared to, say, the US? What you travel around the world. What would your fair judgment be on their evolution, development? There have been some very successful sports people, and as you say, in the music industry, etc.
Yeah. The African Caribbean community, I think, are probably taking the brunt of disadvantage communities, certainly here and in the US. I think things are changing now with the target or the enemy being Muslim communities by right-wing society. You can look to America. The figures for America in terms of their penitentiary system and their prisons is unbelievable in terms of the number of black Americans are locked up. And we always have compared ourselves to America and said, well, we're not as bad as America. Well, that's interesting because, since I remember, the prison system, when I worked in the probation service, our prison population was about 40,000. It is today 86,000 people. So in the space of 20 odd years, we've more than doubled our prison population. And I think that's a good indication of what's going on. So we've always had a black, Caribbean and small Asian community in the prison system. About 28% of all people in the prison system have been from a black and minority ethnic background. That's been a consistent figure. We've never really addressed that, and we've never really challenged that properly. But look at the figures today. We've always looked at America and said, oh, they're far worse. But you look at the youth custody figures today. So what am I talking about? 15 to 17-year-olds. 15 to 17-year-olds in Britain today, 45% are from a black or Asian background. 45%. That's way bigger than any US prison system. Now, if you allow that to continue, over half our prison population is going to be either black or Asian. We've seen an enormous increase, a tenfold increase in the Muslim prison population, and they're Muslims. Only 1% of them are there because of terrorists or radicalisation. They're there because of other crimes. So something is going wrong in society still when 45% of your youth custody population is from a small proportion of the community. So, of course, Britain's a great place to be. It gives you all the opportunities to be, but inequality still exists. And this, has to be linked to public policy. It has to be linked to legislation. It has to be linked to economic successes of a community and a society. And discrimination still exists.
Sure. I mean, you've touched on a little bit about the Muslim community. Clearly, in the current climate, they're facing the brunt of criticism and attacks from far right, etc. Do you think the government have got it right in dealing with social cohesion, integration and the extremist agenda? Or do you think we need to be a lot better at it? What do you think in the last few minutes that we've got left?
I think there's, all sorts of views on this. If we're talking about the Muslim community, I'm in a very interesting position. I'm Hindu. My wife's Muslim. I've seen it from all sorts of spheres. Clearly, we've not got this right. We've allowed organisations like the English Defence League to exploit the fact that you can exploit religion to be the evil as opposed to race, and to target a Muslim community in the way it has done, and for government to allow that to happen without challenging it and to take an easy option, an easy ride, is not right. We ourselves have to challenge this, but simplistic things like giving £20 million to Muslim mothers to learn English is a great thing, but why are they Muslim mothers? It's any mother who can't speak English, surely, and you shouldn't have taken it out in the first place. And I think to make a simplistic connection between extremism and that is damaging. We have to be a little bit more sophisticated. My view is we all need to sit around the table and talk about the elephants in the room and the skeletons in the cupboard and really thrash this out as a way forward, because this is where we all live. We all live in Britain. This is our country. Whether we're Muslims, Hindus or Christians, we live here together, and that's what we need to do, and we need to tackle these things together.
Well, I think that's probably a fantastic place to finish. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Lord Kamlesh Patel. Really inspirational with all you've achieved. And like you, I agree. I think this is a fantastic country to live in. We have challenges in this country and across the world as well, but that's for us all to work together. And through people like yourselves, hopefully, we will change things for the better. So thanks very much.
Any small contribution I can make, I will. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So until next time, it's goodbye from me.